Meet Vladimir Bonarenko. He was an aviation engineer in Ukraine until his country's infrastructure for aviation fell apart. His frustration with this collapse led him to start blogging, and eventually a lot of his writing was featured on Ukraine Today, a media outlet that has been publishing articles for the past few years, making Ukraine look like a failed state. This is Ukraine Today's editor-in-chief, Irina Kerimova. She used to be a guitar teacher until similarly her frustrations with politics and the government led her towards writing and expressing her irritation. Here's the thing about Vladimir and Irina. They don't exist. These are computer-generated faces, and you can kind of tell if you look closely. Vladimir's ear is a bit messed up, and Irina is rocking just one earring. It's not exactly an Eastern European fashion trend at the moment. And if you go on to an artificial face generator, one like, I don't know, thispersondoesnotexist.com, you'll see that one of the things AI has the hardest time with are ears. That and other people who happen to be in the photo. Ukraine Today was recently kicked off of Facebook because its website was connected to some of the Russian propaganda makers identified by the US State Department a few years ago. These are the same propaganda makers who use AI to develop little bots that leave mean tweets and harass people who talk about race, climate, politics, anything touchy. The fact that this stuff happens is probably not news to anybody. We've been hearing about this for years. Fake news, misinformation, disinformation. It almost feels like a exhausted topic. The only thing is we keep talking about it because it keeps disrupting our lives in such a severe way. It feels like one of the most pressing issues of our time that it's easy to forget that false information being spread by the media for political manipulation, it's not exactly new. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams ran for president against each other, and even though these two guys were friendly for most of their careers, this is where it got really nasty. Jefferson's team started a rumor about John Adams being a hermaphrodite who returned the favor by starting a rumor about Thomas Jefferson being a half-breed, having mixed native ancestry, and the fact that they were even using these things as insults from each other lets you know how problematic and nasty this got. The 1826 campaign is considered by many to be the nastiest campaign in US presidential history. Like, you think things are bad now, but the stuff that John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson were spreading about each other on the front page of major newspapers was just ridiculous. Then in the late 1800s, you have the whole practice of yellow journalism, the exaggeration of headlines and sensational stories that many people think drove public opinion towards the Spanish-American War. So yeah, it's not new. But it definitely seems like a very timely issue. During the time frame of my lifetime, it certainly feels like it's gotten worse. And it seems like in every major event our world goes through, disinformation plays a role in it somehow.
The majority of people in America have seen misinformation that has originated with this super spreader.
Bogus stories spreading right-wing conspiracy theories, often in Spanish.
And when I'm looking at social media, you'll have seen this too. There's such a spectrum of mis and disinformation out there.
So much of this comes down to the biggest purveyor of modern disinformation, Russia. Okay, hold up. I gotta pause myself here real quick to say something important. When I refer to Russia in this context, I'm of course talking about its leaders, like Vladimir Putin's regime, and not just like Russian people en masse. All right, if you watch my stuff, I kind of take it you know that, but I think it's really important to be clear about that because, it's totally fair game to call out a lot of governments, a lot of leaders, a lot of regimes around the world. That's important when they're doing wrong. But if you don't do that carefully, and if you don't make that distinguishing mark between the government and the people of that country, some even more bad stuff can happen. And so there are a lot of Russian people who are trying to work against this, against really ridiculous odds. There's a lot of them doing brave things, and I gotta highlight that too. And also it's worth noting that I'm about to get into why Russia's use of disinformation was so unique and really kind of took it to a whole nother level. But I'm about to let myself talk again by going into why they are not the only ones who have done that. In fact, the US has as well. In 1953, the United States CIA had a plan to overthrow the Iranian prime minister that involved planting newspaper stories in country. After the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, again, the US CIA planted fake stories in neighboring Muslim countries about Invasion Day celebrations going on at USSR embassies. A study in 2019 found that 70 countries and their governments around the world had engaged in disinformation campaigns. However, only 7 of those countries were involved in using them to manipulate information at a global level, influencing stuff internationally, just beyond their own country's borders. Of these 7, Russia was unique in its scale and ambition, using these media manipulation tactics to completely shift balances in world power. Use of disinformation as a strategy by the Russian state has a deep and complex history. Back in the Cold War, Joseph Stalin's great Soviet encyclopedia included the term disinformatia. This was defined as the dissemination via press or radio of false information intended to mislead public opinion. I've been lucky enough to get to know some people from North Korea, and what you see there is much more of what we typically think of when we think of disinformation. The state closes everything off to outside media. Even dramas from South Korea are prohibited, and in doing so, they only broadcast information and stories that would build a sense of loyalty to the Kim regime. What Russia is doing is almost the total inversion of that. It's tough to keep a tight grip on what people can and can't access. Instead, they're flooding what people can access with all kinds of stuff, making it very difficult to parse through what is meaningful and what's not. You get sensational stories, false stories, true stories that are just designed to provoke strong reactions. All of this is fair game. Quantity matters more than quality because the goal isn't to spread a single lie. It's to create an environment where people can no longer distinguish a lie. And there's no shortage of people talking about disinformation. You have think tanks trying to come up with policies to help curb it. You have a bunch of academic reports and policy journals categorizing, investigating the sources of information. But in spite of all this attention, I still feel like something is missing. There's something I find unsatisfying. Why this is happening. What's in it for Russia? Why go through all this effort? Like, you just want to spread ridiculous stories about all kinds of things. What's the point? What I often end up getting are just these very simplistic answers. Maybe that Russia wants to prop up a conservative US government because it's more favorable to Russia. Okay, but then that doesn't explain why in early 2020 they tried to use some of their usual tactics to get Bernie Sanders elected. Other folks might say, well, that's just because Russia wants chaos. They want to divide us. They want to flood the zone with all kinds of stuff. And that's true. That's an accurate assessment. But I'm still not satisfied leaving it at that. There's so much more to this story, the strategy that's going on here. It doesn't help us to just think of Russia as the Joker. Chaos for the sake of chaos.
They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Russia has a bigger motive, one that's rooted in the history of the world's powers. Telling the story could go back centuries if we wanted it to, but let's pick things up at the end of World War II. Western Europe and Japan are ravaged by the war, which pretty much leaves only 2 countries with the economic and military strength to be considered the world's superpowers. That's the United States and the USSR. And this is a rivalry that basically writes the history books for the latter half of the 20th century. The US and the USSR go up against each other in wars taking place on other countries' soils, in technological competitions to get to space, and Russians are like the bad guys in like a whole generation's worth of our movies.
I must break you.
It's worth noting that while many leaders of the USSR and Russia have always tried to position it as a giant single entity, there have always been a diversity of people living within its borders. Its large geographical area allows for so many different ethnic groups and histories and people groups in there. There's this great video by Johnny Harris that goes over the geographical origins of Russia and why people living in Russia can look so diverse from one another. It's perhaps more helpful to think of the USSR in a literal sense, a union of Soviet republics. And all these differences between the republics that comprised it played a role in how it came apart. As the 1990s begin, the USSR goes from being the US's main competitor and this global powerhouse to suddenly ending. In 1990, the Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian republics within the USSR all declared that the union no longer existed. Rebellions and protests ignited, and that same year you saw these 6 republics declare their independence. The following year, Azerbaijan, the northern Stan countries, Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia would also declare independence, and the USSR was no more. All of this seemed to mark the end of an era. Russia became more open to multinational corporations, and the big threat of nuclear war suddenly no longer felt as immediate. It was perhaps too easy of an ending of some of the biggest tensions that the world had been seeing for decades. But for a lot of people back in Russia, particularly those who held power, it was like, what do you mean we're not the power anymore? It was within this late Soviet era that Vladimir Putin's career began. And from his point of view, Russia can and should be the continuation of the power and influence the USSR once held. He believes it can get back there, and nostalgia is a hell of a drug. I mean, think of what happens in the US when people going through a hard time are promised a return to their former glory days. But his view of power is a zero-sum game, and that means competing powers must be weakened. Those biggest threats are the West, the US, Western Europe, the European Union, and NATO. And by far the most effective way for Russia to weaken these powers is to make them fall victim to the same thing that broke up the USSR. Division. When the United States is unable to act cohesively because of internal divisions, or when a rift is going on between Great Britain and the EU that drives Brexit, or when the different member states of the European Union are at odds with one another, kind of prioritizing individual interests over the strength of the Union, it ultimately reduces their collective power. And to be honest, he's had some successes in there. Very real successes that we've been feeling and dealing with and living through for the past few years. If you're living in the US, it's easy to see how this division has gotten more and more pronounced in our politics and our culture. But this is also a global phenomenon. Every European nation seems to have seen a rise in far-right nationalism and white supremacy over the past decade. And if you think things are bad in the United States, it's even worse in places around the world that were already quite unstable. We've seen these media manipulation tactics influence public behaviors and opinions in the Philippines and Brazil. Facebook campaigns have been especially bad in Myanmar and Ethiopia, and these have largely contributed to the demonstrations, protests, and borderline civil wars happening in those places. Remember, the goal isn't to provide one single lie, it's to divide and destabilize. And this is why when Jonathan Albright launched an investigation into Russian-backed imposter Facebook pages, he found the same sources behind pages of all kinds of political persuasions. Secured Borders was an anti-immigrant account, and Texas Rebels provided state pride alongside attacks on Democrats. But at the same time, these groups were also launching LGBT United, which you can probably figure out what that was about, and Blacktivists, which kind of propped itself up as a satellite of Black Lives Matter. When you have all this going on, it disorients people en masse. You have half the people jumping into the fray and making things even more polarized, and the other half of the people just saying, like, I don't even know anymore who to trust, so I'm out, and disengaging. And both can do serious harm. Here's a photo of Alexander Malkovich. He's actually one of the people behind these misinformation operations, and look at this map. It's color-coded by state, listing out the issues of concern in each state. It's in Russian, but purple here is the Second Amendment, green is poverty, brown is for taxes, navy is for race, blue for crime, gray for unemployment, and it looks like none of that really matters in Wisconsin. This guy was also behind a really shady news site called USA Really, which would be cool if it was just that Weekend Update segment that Seth Meyers and Amy Poehler used to do.
I mean, really?
Instead, it was also behind a lot of false information, and you know that media bias chart you often see on social media that positions all the different publications? Look at what they did. USA Really is right there in the sweet spot. Even your bias chart can be tampered with. See, the thing about this strategy is that whether or not we're sharing stories that are just outright wrong, we're all contributing in some way to this environment of misinformation and confusion. And while Russia has definitely revolutionized the strategy and scale at which it happens, they're playing with stuff that has already existed. They're working with tendencies that are deeply embedded into human psychology. They understand the way tribalism works, and the fact that people don't always make decisions based on empirical reasoning and facts, but where they find a sense of belonging. That's why you're sometimes likely to have your mind made up about whether or not you agree with a person before you even know what they've said. And this weirdly makes sense from an This weirdly makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, like you'd think it would jeopardize us to not have an accurate perception of the world, but really what protects us from a lot of threats is being part of a group, and so we prioritize that sense of belonging even on top of having accurate information. Another psychological challenge is simply no one likes to admit that they're wrong. In an era where no matter what you say gets you clapbacks, it just kind of triggers this defense mechanism of wanting to double down on what you say. We double down on mistakes, and I mean, when was the last time you saw a public figure apologize in a way that felt sincere and not like a PR move? At this point, the problem of disinformation probably feels pretty vast. You have one of the world's most powerful nations invested in it. You have a whole array of human psychology features working against you. It's like, can anything actually be done? You know, it's bad enough that this thing is destabilizing governments and creating chaos. It's doing some real serious damage around the world. It's directly taking lives. It's convinced people not to take simple basic precautions that could have prevented their deaths. It's split up families. It's caused friends to stop speaking to each other. I'm sure you know somebody who you can still, physically talk to, but talking to them is not like talking to the person you used to know. There's this support group called Q Casualties for people who have basically lost loved ones to conspiracy theories, and there's some heartbreaking stuff that you can find written there. One guy who, doesn't really recognize his wife anymore after she's kind of just gone down the rabbit hole of all the forces working in the world that only she can see in a select few. It's really sad. If you just go online and try and look up how to fight disinformation, I'm afraid you don't always find very many helpful things. You might find links to a fact checker, or just some resources on how to properly vet a news source. I often find recommendations for policymakers or social media companies to implement, but it doesn't really leave you or I with a whole lot to do other than to vote wisely, which is important, but it's just one thing. Or you might find something like a media bias chart, which can also be subject to manipulation or its own biases, or some sort of resource talking about fact checkers and how to properly vet sources. That's all good, but even if we're not falling for misinformation, we're still living in a world that's shaped by it. What are we supposed to do about that? The good news is that there are some things we can do that are proactive. The first is to prioritize solutions over scapegoats. So in Ukraine right now, we've got a lot of reports of people fleeing the country, and a lot of stories of how Africans and South Asians are being rejected at neighboring borders. And these are true stories. They're backed by first-hand accounts and reports from those countries' embassies. I think it's really important to call this out, to acknowledge that this is racism, and that it's happening and shouldn't. And at the very same time, you can see how there's an incentive for Putin to use these stories to curb some of the goodwill that's been going towards Ukraine and the European solidarity that's emerged lately. Now, if you frame every crisis along the lines of who are the bad guys and who are the good guys, what's the us versus them narrative, who do I blame for these problems, you fall right into that hand. However, if you're looking for solutions, if you're more interested in principles over partisanship, you can take more of a yes and approach. You can say, yes, it's good to help people fleeing from violence. Yes, it's great that we've seen a lot of solidarity and support of the people of Ukraine who are being terrorized and bullied. And it's wrong what we're seeing people of color facing at these borders. And you can even see how these issues are connected. It all comes down to how we value each other, how we value human life. One of the things I find infuriating about most political discussions, and I'm sure you probably do too, is it quickly becomes a matter of how can I prove my side is right, how can I prove that you're wrong, instead of just looking at a problem that's going to affect both of us and trying to brainstorm a solution. The other thing we've got to do is be careful not to spread it. And I'm not just saying don't hit retweet when you see an article about how Gerald Ford is really still alive and in disguise as Oprah, but I mean when you see false, harmful, or bad information, don't repeat it, not even in the process of trying to dunk on it. I see this so often on Twitter, and this is becoming a pet peeve of mine, like a blogger or a congressperson will tweet just like a really bad take, maybe even a harmful one, and a bunch of people I follow will start retweeting it, will start quote tweeting it to dunk on it, to just point out how ridiculous it is, sometimes in hilarious ways, I gotta admit. But the thing is, that original tweet is still getting retweets, it's still getting eyeballs, and the algorithm isn't figuring out that you're trying to dunk on it. They're just saying, hey, there's a lot of activity happening here, I bet people want to see this, and so even more people see it. Like, there's a reason why I don't follow that person in the first place. I follow you because I like what you have to say, not them. One of the reasons why this bugs me so much is because of an idea I heard from James Clear. It's that the amount of people who believe an idea is directly proportionate to the amount of times that that idea is repeated. I'm guessing you don't know anyone who believes that Gerald Ford Oprah conspiracy theory because I just made it up and I don't know anyone else who's repeated it. But I have the crazy suspicion that if it were to gain traction, no matter how ridiculous it was, you'd find some takers. The best thing that can happen to a harmful idea is for it to just fade into obscurity. And instead, we can focus on telling the better story. This is why I'm so committed to telling stories about solutions to things like climate change. Better yet, telling the stories of the people who are just dedicated to solving that problem. It's a more beautiful story anyway. I often say that the opposite of conspiracy is hope. And so this idea that an idea is believed more the more that it's shared, well, we can get that to work in our favor. Tell the better story. Tell it again and again, and tell it in a beautiful way. It's really tough to argue with beauty. From the start, the challenge of disinformation has always been a challenge of storytelling. And this is why I take my role as a storyteller so seriously. Change the way you look at things, and the things you look at will change. Our world is shaped by the stories we tell ourselves, from who is deserving of what, to who we can even trust. A mess of contradictory, chaotic stories right now are making a mess of our world. But a beautiful story, told with heart, can still make an impact. In this day and age, we are all storytellers to a certain extent. We all live lives based on a story we've heard, one we've chosen consciously or perhaps unconsciously to accept. Now that you know, choose wisely.